Hi there. So we are continuing our discussion of soils. We've been talking about how does soil form to begin with. Of course, we know about primary succession and what goes into breaking down bedrock, like lava rock is the example we keep using. Of course, it's not always lava rock, and it's important for you to understand that. But whatever the parent material is, what the process is by which that starts being broken down into smaller and smaller pieces through both mechanical and chemical weathering, and then the forces of biological weathering, and all the organisms that start moving in as that rock is broken down, and the organisms that are able to then thrive in those conditions and further break down the material and add waste and other lovely, nasty things like decaying carcasses and everything. But all of this being really important to contribute to the nutrients in the soil and start building up that nice layer of topsoils. So soil, of course, is necessary for a lot of things. Living organisms rely on soil, and it's also really important for humans for agricultural purposes, and for growing things like lumber, right? So trees that we cut down for lumber. Soil also provides very important ecological services like nutrient cycling that we've talked about as being one of the extremely important ecological services that we rely on. Soil also helps to purify water and also helps to break down waste. So of course that would be all of the millions of bacteria and other decomposers that are living in soil and sort of become part of it. So it's important for you to understand that soil is a living thing. And so if we were classifying things as biotic or abiotic, soil would definitely fall in that biotic category. Mature soils contain many layers, horizontal layers, which we call horizons. And if you look at a cross-sectional view of horizons, you would call this a soil profile. So the main horizons in mature soils are the O horizon, which would consist of the leaf litter, so leaves falling off of trees onto the ground we call leaf litter. Below that would be what we call the topsoil, which is the A horizon. Below that is the B horizon, which is the subsoil, and then the lowest is the C horizon. And this would consist of the weathered parent material. And actually, we would say that the C horizon sits on the actual parent material, which would be bedrock. So the different layers, these different horizons have different textures and thicknesses and compositions depending on what climate they come from, and also the biome. And we haven't spent time talking about biomes yet, but these would be things like deserts and grasslands and forests. So the different mechanisms at work there lend to the different soil horizons and how they present themselves in these different systems. Okay, so here you're just looking at some of these different soil profiles of different biomes. So in some of like the main ecosystems, so the top left, you're looking at a desert soil profile, and then we have tropical rainforest, deciduous forest, coniferous forest, as well as grassland soil. And you can see here, if you read the descriptions, that they have these different characteristics. So whether they're acidic or more basic or alkaline, if they have a lot of calcium here or salts, if they're more sandy or have more clay, and we'll talk more about what those mean for different soils. Okay, so of course, we've talked about different ways that soils form. And there are different factors that affect the rate at which soils form. Warm and wet environments lend to quicker soil formation. It's important for you to know, though, that while tropical rainforests definitely meet these conditions of being both warm and wet, and so we would say they would have a lot of soil formation or very quick soil formation, the soils in tropical rainforests are not considered to be fertile soils. And this is because there's a lot of competition for the nutrients that are released during decomposition of organic matter. So in those warm, moist conditions, organic matter can be broken down very quickly and those nutrients are released. And so that's really important for the organisms living in these different places, like the plants. But because there's so much plant growth in tropical rainforests, there's a lot of competition for those nutrients. And so what you end up with is a soil that is actually deplete of most nutrients, because most of those nutrients are actually stored in the above ground biomass. So rainforests are very productive ecosystems, but it's all above ground. You're not finding much in the actual soil itself. Okay, so the importance of soil nutrients. Most plant roots and organic matter are found in the upper 2 layers of soil. So in the O horizon, which remember is the leaf litter, and in the A horizon, which is what we call topsoil. In these 2 layers, there's a lot of bacteria and fungi and worms and insects, and a lot of these are decomposers. There's also larger organisms like snails and reptiles and amphibians. So fertile soils are capable of producing high crop yields if they have a thick layer of topsoil with a lot of humus mixed with minerals from the weathered rock. Then they would be very fertile and really good for growing crops. So we were talking on the previous slide about why having these wet conditions are good for soil nutrients and the making of soils. This moisture acts to dissolve nutrients and then makes them able to be taken up by plants. So I'm sure you've learned in biology at some point about, or chemistry, the polarity of water and why water is considered to be a universal solvent. And so these different nutrients that plants need are able to dissolve in water and be transported through plants in water. The bacteria in soils are an important way that nitrogen is cycled. Nitrogen compounds are considered to be a limiting nutrient in most ecosystems. So the addition of nitrogen is really important for plant growth. And because it is limited, it's important that it's able to be recycled through the environment. And so when we talk more about biogeochemical cycles, we will talk about the way that nitrogen is cycled through the earth and the atmosphere. And the bacteria in the soil are definitely an important component of this. Healthy soils actually retain more water and so are able to help reduce drought conditions by releasing water into the atmosphere. So soils not only are an important component of the nitrogen cycle, but they're also an important component of the water cycle. If you look at the color of soil, it can really tell you how well plants are able to grow in it, and particularly looking at the color of topsoil. So black or dark brown soils are high in nitrogen and also high in organic matter, so would be considered fertile soils, good for plant growth. If your topsoil is gray or yellow or red, this means that it is low in organic matter and also probably needs some extra nitrogen. So this would be soils that if this is what you had at home and you were just, planting a garden, you would add fertilizer. And of course, with industrialized agriculture, this would mean that farmers would be probably using high amounts of fertilizers to be able to grow their crops in their fields with these sorts of conditions. The B horizon, remember the subsoil, and the C horizon, which is the weathered material on top of the parent material or bedrock, contains most of the inorganic matter in soil. So this is a lot of broken down rock, generally a mixture of sand, silt, and clay and gravel. So we need to also talk about porosity and permeability. And so let's look at this graphic to talk about this. So soils consist of particles of 3 different sizes. So you can see here there are these very small clay particles, silt particles, which are considered to be a medium size, and then the larger sand particles. And the relative amounts of particles and the amount of space between them determines the soil texture. So when we talk about soil porosity, we're talking about a measure of the open spaces. So the spaces that you see here between the different particles. And this texture determines the permeability of the soils. So permeability refers to how fast water moves through the different soils. Gravel has high permeability, right? And clay has low permeability. Here, of course, you're looking at sand, so gravel would be considered to be even larger particle sizes. But you can see here with the larger particles, they don't really fit as compactly together. And so you have less conduits for which the water can flow through. So the more tightly those particles are able to fit together, the less permeability that the soils will have. And so permeability is also important because it relates to the capacity of the different soils to hold nutrients. Soils with a lot of clay are more fertile because the clay particles are actually negatively charged, and so they're able to bind ions or other particles with a negative charge. With a positive charge. So some important nutrients that would have a positive charge are calcium and potassium ions. So these would have an attraction to the clay particles. Loam topsoil is considered to be one of the best for plant growth. It has a sort of a spongy, crumbly texture. And the reason that it is considered to be good for plant growth is that it is sort of an intermediate soil in terms of permeability. So water doesn't flow really quickly through it, and it also doesn't flow too slowly. So water is able to flow through at sort of a nice slow trickle. Loam soils are made up of about 40% sand, 40% silt, and 20% clay. And because of this rather slow permeability or water flow, they're able to hold more nutrients and also water and humus than more sandy soils. And they also have better drainage than clay or silt soils. Okay, so we're talking here about how important soils are for humans, specifically with regards to agriculture, but unfortunately our agricultural practices are having negative impacts on the soils that support this practice. Agriculture, as it has become more industrialized, has had more and more environmental impacts. And one of these impacts is soil erosion, so specifically erosion of topsoils. Topsoil erosion does occur naturally, but human impacts are increasing this. So the three major effects that have been harmful from soil erosion are the loss of soil fertility, which means there's less nutrients in the topsoil available for plants. Secondly, erosion of topsoil lends to polluted waters or surface waters. So when topsoil erodes, it ends up as sediment in streams and waterways, and it can overload the waterways with nutrients from the plants. And this can cause eutrophication. So just a reminder, eutrophication is when you have a lot of plant growth that then breaks down and bacteria decompose it. And as those bacteria come in to decompose it, they actually use up all the oxygen in the water. And so you end up with very low dissolved oxygen content in the water. A third way that erosion is having a negative impact on soils or a negative impact in ecosystems is through the release of carbon that is stored in the soil. So as soil is eroded, a lot of the carbon that is stored in it is actually released to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. So this contributes to both atmospheric warming and to climate change. Okay, so these are just showing you different ways in which water can erode topsoils. So water erosion, of course, happens naturally, but it also can be exacerbated by human activities. So like if you look at the first picture here, you can see that this is a field. So perhaps there was just a lot of rain, but also presumably there's been a lot of irrigation happening in this field. So erosion by water can happen as three different types. This first one here is called sheet erosion. Sheet erosion occurs on flat land and removes thin layers or sheets of topsoil. This second one over here is what we call rill erosion. Rill erosion causes these little tiny streams, and they actually carve little channels called rills in the topsoil. The third type of water erosion is here. It's called gully erosion. And gully erosion is caused by larger streams. And so basically water can remove enough of the soil to actually create these large gullies. Okay, wind erosion, of course, is a natural phenomenon. But as we also, through our agricultural practices where we clear vegetation to then plant, can exacerbate the impacts of wind erosion. So wind, of course, loosens and blows away topsoil particles, and this can be a lot worse in dry climates with flat land, and particularly if they're not covered by vegetation. So vegetation is important because the roots of plants help to anchor the topsoil. So through farming practices and overgrazing and things like deforestation, whereby vegetation is removed, we are actually making soils more susceptible to wind erosion. Okay, this graphic here is just showing you different parts of the world where erosion is a more serious concern. And if you look at the geographical patterns here, you can see that places that have drier, hotter conditions are oftentimes the places where topsoil erosion is more of a serious concern. Okay, we're going to stop here, and I'm going to do another video on the rest of the PowerPoint, so please look for that, and I'll see y'all later.